The gunshot echoed through the streets of Leadville, Colorado like thunder across the mountain peaks, sending citizens scattering in all directions as Eleanor Kent ducked behind a water trough, her heart hammering against her ribs. It was September 1883, and the silver mining town nestled high in the Rocky Mountains was supposed to be her fresh start, not the place where she'd be branded a criminal before the sun had properly risen. "Stop that woman." Sheriff Dawson's voice boomed down Harrison Avenue as Eleanor pressed her back against the rough wooden boards of the trough, clutching the small leather pouch that had caused all the trouble. She hadn't stolen it, she'd simply taken back what was rightfully hers. Eleanor peered around the corner of the trough, her copper-colored hair falling across her face as she assessed her options. The sheriff and his deputies were closing in from the north end of the street, while curious onlookers gathered at a safe distance, eager for the morning's entertainment. Leadville had seen its share of thieves and desperados since the silver boom began, but a woman being chased through town was novel enough to draw attention. "She's behind the trough," someone called out, and Eleanor cursed under her breath. So much for the kindness of strangers. She gripped the pouch tighter and prepared to run again when a hand suddenly closed around her wrist. She nearly screamed, but the sound died in her throat as she found herself staring into the most startling blue eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a tall man with sun-bronzed skin and a strong jawline partially hidden beneath several days' worth of stubble. His dark hair curled out from beneath a well-worn Stetson, and despite the firm grip on her wrist, there was something in his expression that didn't read as threatening. "Follow me if you want to get out of this," he said, his voice low and even. "Who are you?" Eleanor hissed, trying to pull away. "Isaac Calloway," he replied, tipping his hat slightly, "and right now I'm your only chance at avoiding jail." Eleanor hesitated, weighing her limited options as the sound of boot steps grew closer. The stranger Isaac released her wrist and extended his hand. Making a split-second decision that she hoped wouldn't be her last, Eleanor placed her hand in his. In one fluid motion, Isaac pulled her to her feet and led her toward the alley between the assayer's office and the mercantile. They moved quickly, weaving through stacks of crates and barrels until they reached a chestnut mare tethered at the back. "Get on," Isaac instructed, cupping his hands to give her a boost. Eleanor gathered her skirts and placed her boot in his interlaced fingers, allowing him to lift her onto the horse. She'd barely settled when Isaac swung up behind her, his chest pressing against her back as he reached around to take the reins. "Hold on tight," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear as he urged the horse forward. They rode hard out of the alley and down a side street, the mare's hooves kicking up dust as they raced toward the edge of town. Eleanor could hear shouting behind them, but it grew fainter with each passing moment as they put distance between themselves and the law. "You realize you're aiding a fugitive," Eleanor called over her shoulder as they left the last buildings of Leadville behind and headed toward the tree line that marked the beginning of the wilderness. Isaac's chuckle rumbled through his chest. "They called you a thief," he said, guiding the horse onto a narrow trail that climbed into the foothills. "But I know better than to believe everything I hear in this town." Eleanor twisted in the saddle to look at him, surprised by his response. "You don't know me." "I could be exactly what they say I am." Something flickered in Isaac's eyes, amusement, perhaps, or a challenge. "Maybe, but I saw what happened back at the bank. That pouch you're holding so tight it's yours, isn't it?" Eleanor's fingers reflexively tightened around the leather. "How did you know?" "I was there," he explained, slowing the horse as they ventured deeper into the forest. "Saw how Rutherford tried to cheat you, saw you take back what's rightfully yours." The horse picked its way carefully along the trail as Eleanor processed his words. "You were watching me." "Not intentionally," Isaac replied. "I was at the bank on my own business, but it's hard not to notice when a lady like you stands up to a man like Horace Rutherford." The mention of the banker's name made Eleanor's jaw tighten. "He claimed my father's gold deposit was never recorded. Said there was no proof the money was mine after father died." "And I'm guessing you found proof," Eleanor patted the pouch. "Father's bank book, it was in his desk at home, shows every deposit he made. When I showed it to Rutherford this morning, he called me a liar and a forger. Had his clerk try to take it from me? Isaac nodded, as if her story confirmed something he already suspected. Rutherford's been stealing from dead men's accounts for years. Most widows and orphans don't have the means or courage to challenge him. They rode in silence for a while, following the winding trail as it climbed higher into the mountains. Eventually, Isaac guided the horse into a small clearing where a cabin stood, partially hidden by towering pines. "My place," he said simply, bringing the horse to a stop and dismounting. He reached up to help Eleanor down, his hands strong and steady as they spanned her waist. For a moment after her feet touched the ground, they stood close enough that Eleanor could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, could smell the leather and pine scent that clung to him. Then she stepped back, suddenly aware of the impropriety of their situation. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, clutching her pouch of evidence against her chest. Isaac led his horse toward a small stable attached to the cabin. "Let's get inside, I'll explain while we have some coffee." The interior of the cabin was simple, but a far cry from what Eleanor might have expected from a bachelor's quarters in the wilderness. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, a sturdy table and chairs occupied another, and a bed with a colorful quilt stood in the corner. Shelves lined with books suggested that Isaac Calloway was more than just another rough frontier man. While he built a fire and set a pot of coffee to boil, Eleanor took in her surroundings, wondering just what kind of man she'd entrusted her freedom to. He moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in his own space. But there was a watchfulness about him too, as if he were always half expecting trouble. "You're wondering if you've jumped from the frying pan into the fire," Isaac said, placing 2 steaming cups of coffee on the table and gesturing for her to sit. Eleanor settled onto a wooden chair, arranging her skirts around her. "The thought had crossed my mind. Fair enough." Isaac took the seat across from her. "I helped you because I've seen what Rutherford does to people in this town. 3 years ago, my brother invested everything he had in a mining claim. When he died in a cave-in, Rutherford claimed there was no record of his holdings, took it all." Understanding dawned on Eleanor. "You've been waiting for a chance to expose him." Isaac nodded, his fingers tightening around his cup. "I came to Leadville to find proof, but Rutherford's careful, keeps his books locked up tight. Until now." Eleanor placed the leather pouch on the table between them. "This proves he's been falsifying records." Isaac's eyes fixed on the pouch, a gleam of hope kindling in their blue depths. "That might be enough to bring him down if we can get it to the right people." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "You do realize the sheriff is looking for me. I can't exactly waltz into town and file a complaint." A slow smile spread across Isaac's face, transforming his serious features. "No, but I can, and I know just the person who might help us, Judge Matthews in Denver. He's been suspicious of Rutherford for years. Denver is nearly 100 miles from here," Eleanor pointed out, "and in the meantime, I'm still a wanted woman." Isaac took a thoughtful sip of his coffee. "We'll need to lay low for a while. I can send a message to the judge without going into town myself." He studied her face. "I'm afraid you're stuck with me for a few days, Miss Kent." The way he said her name, formal, yet somehow intimate, sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor. She'd been alone since her father's death 2 months prior, fighting her battles single-handedly in a town that favored men of means over women of principle. "I suppose there are worse fates than hiding out with a mysterious cowboy," she said, attempting to lighten the mood. Isaac's laugh was rich and genuine. "I'm hardly mysterious, just a former rancher trying to set things right." Former, a shadow crossed his face. "After my brother died, I sold our family ranch in Texas, came here looking for answers." "And revenge?" Eleanor asked softly. "Justice," Isaac corrected. "Which brings us back to our current predicament. If Sheriff Dawson finds you here, we'll both be in trouble." "Then the law can arrest me too," Isaac said with a shrug, "though I'd prefer to avoid that outcome if possible." Eleanor felt a rush of gratitude mixed with an emotion she couldn't quite name. This man had risked everything to help a stranger, all because he recognized an injustice when he saw one. In the cutthroat world of Leadville, such integrity was as rare as the silver that had built the town. Thank you, she said simply, meeting his gaze across the table. Isaac nodded, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. For the first time since her father's death, Eleanor felt something besides grief and fear, a fragile hope that perhaps she wasn't alone in her fight after all. Outside, the late morning sun filtered through the pines, casting dappled shadows across the clearing. In town, Sheriff Dawson would be organizing search parties, and Horace Rutherford would be spinning tales of theft and deception. But here in this cabin, a tentative alliance had formed, one that would soon grow into something neither of them could have anticipated. Night fell across the mountains, bringing with it a chill that seeped through the cabin walls despite the fire crackling in the hearth. Eleanor sat wrapped in a woolen blanket that Isaac had given her, watching as he cleaned his Winchester repeater with practiced hands. They'd spent the day planning their next move, with Isaac explaining that he had a friend, a prospector named Walter Jenkins, who could deliver a message to Judge Matthews in Denver without arousing suspicion. Walter's due to pass by tomorrow on his way to his claim, Isaac explained, running an oiled cloth along the rifle's barrel. He owes me a favor, and he's no friend of Rutherford's. Eleanor nodded, trying to ignore the growing awareness of her situation. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man she'd met mere hours ago, completely dependent on his goodwill. Despite his kindness thus far, the vulnerability of her position wasn't lost on her. As if reading her thoughts, Isaac set the rifle aside and cleared his throat. "You'll take the bed tonight," he said, nodding toward the corner where the quilt-covered bed stood. "I'll sleep by the fire." "That's not necessary," Eleanor protested. "I don't want to put you out of your bed. It's no trouble." Isaac's tone was firm but gentle. "My mother raised me better than to let a lady sleep on the floor." The mention of his mother made Eleanor curious. "Is she still alive, your mother?" A sad smile touched Isaac's lips. "No, she passed 5 years ago. Pneumonia took her the winter after my father died." "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly, understanding the weight of such loss. "My mother died when I was 12. It was just father and me after that, until 2 months ago." She swallowed hard. "The mine collapse that killed him also took 14 other men." The whole town mourned, but Rutherford wasted no time trying to erase their financial existence. Isaac's eyes darkened. "Men like him see tragedy as opportunity." "And men like you?" Eleanor asked, studying his face in the firelight. "I see it as a call to action," Isaac replied, meeting her gaze steadily. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared purpose that transcended their brief acquaintance. Eleanor found herself wanting to know more about this man who had risked himself for a stranger's cause. "How did you end up in Leadville?" she asked. "You said you had a ranch in Texas." Isaac leaned back in his chair, his expression turning distant as he recalled the past. "The Circle C Ranch was my father's pride, 3,000 acres of good grazing land in the Texas Panhandle. When he died, my brother Michael and I tried to keep it going, but the drought of '77 hit us hard. We sold off most of the cattle and land, kept just enough to get by." He paused, his fingers absently tracing the grain of the wooden table. Michael had always been drawn to the idea of striking it rich. When news of the silver boom in Leadville reached us, he convinced me it was our chance to rebuild what we'd lost. He came here first, sent letters about the fortune waiting to be uncovered. "But something went wrong," Eleanor prompted gently when he fell silent. Isaac nodded, his jaw tightening. "He found a promising claim, invested everything we had left, then came the telegram saying he'd been killed in a cave-in. By the time I arrived, Rutherford had already declared there was no record of his investment, and the claim had been reassigned to one of Rutherford's associates. That's when you suspected foul play." "I knew something wasn't right," Isaac confirmed. "Michael was careful with his money and meticulous with his paperwork. The letter he sent me a week before his death mentioned that the official registration of his claim was complete." Eleanor's hand unconsciously moved to cover the pouch containing her father's bank book. "Just as my father was careful with his savings." "Exactly." Isaac's eyes flicked to the pouch. "Rutherford preys on the dead because they can't defend themselves. He counts on families being too grief-stricken or intimidated to challenge him." "He didn't count on you," Eleanor observed. A half-smile curved Isaac's mouth. "Nor on you, Miss Kent. Taking back your father's bank book from under Rutherford's nose was a bold move." Eleanor felt her cheeks warm at the admiration in his voice. "Not bold, desperate. I've been trying to access father's savings for weeks. Without it, I can't keep our home. When I found the bank book and saw the proof, I thought Rutherford would have to concede. Instead, he tried to take your evidence and called you a thief," Isaac concluded, "and when you refused to hand it over, I ran," Eleanor confirmed. "Though I hardly expected to end up a fugitive in the mountains with a Texan rancher turned vigilante." Isaac laughed, the sound warming the cabin more effectively than the fire. Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. That night, despite her protests, Eleanor took the bed while Isaac made a pallet near the hearth. Sleep came reluctantly as she lay awake, listening to the night sounds of the mountain forest and the occasional shifting of Isaac on his makeshift bed. Her life had changed completely in the span of a day, and tomorrow would bring new challenges as they put their plan into motion. Yet for all the uncertainty, Eleanor felt a strange sense of peace. The danger wasn't past, but she was no longer facing it alone. As she drifted finally towards sleep, her last conscious thought was of Isaac's words. "Then the law can arrest me too." Such simple words, but they had changed everything. Morning brought the scent of coffee and bacon that roused Eleanor from the first deep sleep she'd had since her father's death. She opened her eyes to find Isaac already up and moving about the cabin, tending to the fire and preparing breakfast. Sunlight streamed through the small windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the golden beams. "Good morning," Isaac said when he noticed her stirring. "Hope you're hungry." Eleanor sat up, quickly smoothing her hair and adjusting her rumpled dress. She felt acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, having slept in her clothes. "I am, actually, thank you." Breakfast was a simple affair of bacon, biscuits, and strong coffee, but to Eleanor, who had been subsisting on whatever she could afford since her funds were frozen, it was a feast. They ate in companionable silence until Isaac spoke. "Walter should be passing through around midday," he said, pouring her a second cup of coffee. "Once he agrees to take our message to Judge Matthews, we'll need to decide what to do next." Eleanor set down her cup. "What do you mean?" "You can't go back to town while the sheriff's looking for you," Isaac pointed out, "and this cabin isn't exactly set up for a lady's long-term comfort." "I hadn't thought that far ahead," Eleanor admitted. In the rush of yesterday's events, she'd been focused solely on escape and securing her evidence. "I suppose I could try to reach Denver myself, find lodging there until the judge can hear my case." Isaac frowned. "The journey's dangerous for a woman alone, especially one with a price on her head. Rutherford's influence extends beyond Leadville. He has connections in mining towns all along the Front Range." "Then what do you suggest?" Eleanor asked, feeling her newfound sense of security beginning to crumble. Before Isaac could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats reached them. He was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, as he moved to the window. "It's too early for Walter," he murmured, peering cautiously outside. His shoulders relaxed slightly. "It's all right, it's just Thomas Whitehorse." "Who?" Eleanor asked, joining him at the window. A man on horseback had entered the clearing. He was tall and lean, with dark hair pulled back from a face that spoke of mixed heritage, part European, part Native American. He rode with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the wilderness. "A friend," Isaac explained, setting his rifle aside. "Ute on his mother's side. His father was a fur trapper. Thomas knows these mountains better than anyone. He works as a guide when he needs money, but mostly keeps to himself." Isaac opened the door and stepped onto the porch, raising a hand in greeting. "Thomas, didn't expect to see you this way for another week." Thomas Whitehorse dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful. "Change of plans," he said, his voice deep and measured. "Thought you should know there's a search party combing the foothills, looking for a woman with copper hair." His dark eyes shifted to Eleanor, who stood hesitantly in the doorway. Isaac's expression tightened. "How many?" "6 men, sheriff's deputies and some of Rutherford's men. They're about 5 miles south, working their way north." Thomas tied his horse to a post. "You've got a few hours at most before they reach this area." Isaac beckoned Eleanor outside. "Thomas, this is Eleanor Kent. Miss Kent, Thomas Whitehorse." Thomas nodded politely. "Miss Kent." "I'd say it's a pleasure, but it seems you've brought trouble to my friend's doorstep." "It wasn't intentional," Eleanor replied, lifting her chin slightly. A hint of amusement flickered in Thomas's eyes. "It rarely is." He turned back to Isaac. "What's your plan?" Isaac ran a hand through his hair, thinking quickly. "I was counting on Walter to get a message to Judge Matthews in Denver, but if the search parties are getting close, you need to move," Thomas finished for him. "I know a place. Old Trapper's Cabin about 15 miles northwest of here. Remote, few people know it exists." Isaac nodded, decision made. "We'll need to pack quickly. Can you lead us there?" "That's why I came," Thomas said. "Figured you might need help getting the lady to safety." Within an hour, they had gathered essential supplies, saddled Isaac's horse, and prepared to depart. Eleanor had changed into a pair of trousers and a flannel shirt that Isaac provided, cinching the two large garments with a belt. The practical clothing would make horseback riding easier and help disguise her identity if they were spotted from a distance. "I feel ridiculous," Eleanor muttered as she emerged from the cabin in her new attire, her copper hair tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. Isaac's eyes widened slightly before he composed his expression. "You look practical," he said diplomatically, though the way his gaze lingered suggested he found the transformation more intriguing than ridiculous. Thomas, already mounted, merely raised an eyebrow. "We should move. There's a storm coming from the west. It'll cover our tracks if we get ahead of it." They set off with Thomas in the lead, Eleanor riding behind Isaac on his mare. The trail quickly became steeper and narrower as they climbed higher into the mountains, following paths that seemed invisible until Thomas pointed them out. The forest grew denser, the towering pines closing around them like silent sentinels. By midday, dark clouds had gathered on the horizon, and the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain. Thomas set a relentless pace, pausing only occasionally to ensure they weren't being followed or to allow the horses a brief rest. During one such stop, Eleanor slid from the saddle, stretching her legs as Isaac and Thomas conferred in low voices. Despite her practical riding clothes, her muscles ached from the unaccustomed hours on horseback. Still, she refused to complain. Every mile they covered was another mile between her and Rutherford's reach. "We'll be at the cabin before nightfall," Isaac told her, offering his canteen. "Thomas says the storm will hit within the hour. It'll be a rough ride for a while." Eleanor took a long drink of the cool water. "I'm tougher than I look, Mr. Calloway." "Isaac," he corrected gently. "I think we're well past formalities given the circumstances," she nodded, acknowledging the truth of his words. "Isaac then, and I'm Eleanor." Something warm flashed in his eyes before he turned away to check the horse's saddle. "We should keep moving. The terrain gets trickier from here." As predicted, the storm caught them with its full fury an hour later. Rain lashed down in sheets, driven by a fierce wind that bent the trees and turned the trail into a muddy morass. Thunder crashed overhead, the lightning illuminating the darkened forest in stark flashes of brilliance. Eleanor clung to Isaac, her arms wrapped tightly around his waist as they followed Thomas's increasingly indistinct figure ahead. Water streamed down her face despite the hat, and her borrowed clothes were soaked through, but she gritted her teeth against the discomfort. This was far from the genteel life she'd known in Leadville, but there was something exhilarating about facing the elements, about matching her will against nature's fury. When the trapper's cabin finally appeared through the curtain of rain, it seemed like a mirage, a small, sturdy structure nestled against an outcropping of rock that provided some shelter from the wind. Thomas dismounted and pushed open the weathered door, disappearing inside briefly before emerging to help with the horses. "It's dry," he announced, which seemed to be his highest praise for the accommodation. The interior of the cabin was indeed dry, if dusty and bare. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, similar to Isaac's cabin but rougher in construction. A crude table, 2 rickety chairs, and a platform bed with a straw-filled mattress constituted the only furniture. Cobwebs draped the corners, and the floor was layered with pine needles and dust. "Home, sweet home," Isaac said wryly, setting down their supplies as Thomas worked to get a fire started in the hearth. Eleanor stood dripping in the center of the room, suddenly aware of how thoroughly soaked she was. Her hair had escaped from beneath the hat and hung in wet tendrils around her face. She must look a fright, she thought, then wondered why she cared. "You should change out of those wet clothes," Isaac said, rummaging through his saddlebags. "I have a spare shirt that might work as a nightshirt for you. It's not much, but it's dry." He handed her a flannel shirt, their fingers brushing in the exchange. Even that brief contact sent an unexpected warmth through Eleanor, which she attributed to the contrast with her chilled skin. "Thomas and I will tend to the horses," Isaac continued, his eyes carefully averted. "Take your time." Once alone, Eleanor peeled off the sodden garments, grateful for the growing warmth from the fire. Isaac's shirt was large enough to serve as a modest covering, falling to mid-thigh. She spread her wet clothes near the hearth to dry, then used a relatively clean corner of a blanket she found on the bed to towel her hair. The men returned some time later, equally drenched but bearing additional firewood and some provisions from their saddlebags. Thomas nodded approvingly at the now blazing fire before setting to work preparing a simple meal of jerky, dried apples, and hardtack softened in hot water. "It's not fancy," he said as they gathered around the fire, "but it'll keep body and soul together." The warmth of the fire, the food, and the relief of being safely sheltered from both the storm and their pursuers created a strange camaraderie among the three of them. Thomas, though initially taciturn, proved to be a compelling storyteller once Eleanor drew him out with questions about his heritage and knowledge of the mountains. "My mother's people have lived in these mountains since before the white man came," he explained, his deep voice carrying easily over the sound of rain hammering the roof. "They taught me the old ways, how to read the weather, track game, find water, live in harmony with the land." "And your father?" Eleanor asked, fascinated by this glimpse into a life so different from her own. A shadow crossed Thomas's face. "He was a trapper, a good man in his way, but he never fully understood my mother's world. When the government forced the Utes onto reservations, he couldn't protect her or her family. It broke something in him." He stared into the fire. "He died hunting, caught in a sudden blizzard. I was 15. "I'm sorry," Eleanor said softly, understanding now why Thomas chose to live between worlds, belonging fully to neither. "It was a long time ago," Thomas replied with a slight shrug. "I learned from both of them how to survive in the white man's world and how to honor the old ways. It served me well." His dark eyes shifted to Isaac. "And occasionally allows me to help friends in need." Isaac nodded gratefully. "We wouldn't have made it here without you." "What will you do next?" Thomas asked, directing the question to both of them. Isaac glanced at Eleanor before responding. "We still need to get word to Judge Matthews in Denver. If Walter can't deliver our message, we'll have to find another way." "I could go," Thomas offered. "I have business in Denver in a few days anyway." Hope flared in Eleanor's chest. "Would you? It would mean everything if the judge could see my father's bank book. And hear about similar cases," Isaac added. "My brother's among them." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "I'll leave at first light." "The storm should pass by then." He looked between them. "You'll be safe here for a while. Few people know of this place, and those who do have no reason to connect it to Isaac." Eleanor felt a wave of gratitude toward this quiet, capable man who had risked himself to help strangers. "Thank you, Mr. Whitehorse." "Thomas," he corrected with the ghost of a smile. "We're well past formalities, as someone recently observed." Later, as the fire burned down to embers and the storm continued its assault outside, Thomas spread his bedroll near the hearth while Isaac insisted Eleanor take the platform bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep eluded her as she listened to the rain and considered the strange turn her life had taken. Just days ago, she had been a respectable young woman trying to navigate the complexities of managing alone after her father's death. Now she was a fugitive, hiding in a remote cabin with two men she barely knew, wearing borrowed clothes and plotting against one of Leadville's most powerful citizens. Yet despite the danger and uncertainty, Eleanor couldn't deny that there was something liberating about her current situation. For the first time, she wasn't bound by the strict conventions that governed a lady's behavior in town. Out here, she was simply a person fighting for justice no different from Isaac or Thomas, and then there was Isaac himself. In the dancing firelight, Eleanor found her gaze drawn repeatedly to his sleeping form. Even in repose, there was a strength about him that inspired confidence. He'd risked everything for her cause, not out of romantic notions or expectation of reward, but because it aligned with his own sense of justice. Such a man was rare, Eleanor thought as she finally drifted toward sleep, and more dangerous to her heart than any outlaw or storm. The morning dawned clear and bright, the storm having spent its fury during the night. Eleanor awoke to the smell of coffee and the low murmur of male voices. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to her surroundings, before rising and quickly dressing in her now dry clothes from the day before. Thomas was preparing to depart, checking his gear while Isaac added provisions to his saddlebags. Both men looked up as Eleanor emerged from behind the crude privacy screen Isaac had rigged the night before. "Good morning," she said, smoothing her hair self-consciously. "Sleep well?" Isaac asked, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted, accepting the steaming cup gratefully. Thomas finished securing his gear and turned to face them. "I should reach Denver in 3 days if the weather holds. Once I make contact with Judge Matthews, it may take time for him to act. Don't expect word for at least a week, maybe 2. The reality of their situation settled over Eleanor 2 weeks in this remote cabin, alone with Isaac once Thomas departed. She glanced at Isaac, wondering if he shared her sudden awareness of the impropriety. If he did, he gave no sign of it. "We'll be fine," he assured Thomas. "There's game in these forests, and I brought enough supplies to last until you return." Thomas nodded, his dark eyes moving between them. "Be cautious. Don't light fires during the day. The smoke can be seen for miles." With a few more words of advice and farewell, Thomas mounted his horse and departed, the sound of hoofbeats gradually fading until silence once again enveloped the cabin. Eleanor stood beside Isaac, watching until Thomas disappeared among the trees. "Well," Isaac said finally, turning to face her. "It seems we have some time on our hands." Eleanor managed a smile despite her suddenly racing heart. "I suppose we'll have to make the best of it." The days that followed established a routine of surprising domesticity. Isaac hunted in the early mornings, bringing back rabbits or grouse that Eleanor prepared for their meals. They rationed the coffee and flour, supplementing their provisions with wild berries and edible plants that Isaac identified from his brother's old guidebook to mountain flora. During the long hours indoors, they talked in a way that Eleanor had rarely experienced. Without the distractions and social constraints of town life, conversation flowed freely, moving from their respective childhoods to their hopes for the future, their opinions on everything from politics to literature. Eleanor discovered that Isaac had a keen mind and a love of reading that matched her own. He'd brought several books in his saddlebags, dog-eared volumes of Twain, Whitman, and even Shakespeare that had traveled with him from Texas. "My mother was a schoolteacher before she married my father," he explained one evening as they sat by the fire, sharing the last of the coffee. "She made sure Michael and I had an education, even if it was mostly at the kitchen table after the day's work was done." "She sounds remarkable," Eleanor said, thinking of her own mother who had similarly valued learning. "My mother taught me French and botany alongside the usual feminine accomplishments. Father encouraged it. He believed women should be educated even if society didn't always agree." "He sounds like a man ahead of his time," Isaac observed. Eleanor smiled sadly. "He was. After Mother died, he taught me about his business, the basics of mining investments, how to read contracts, even how the assaying process worked. The other miners thought it strange, but Father said I needed to understand these things in case something happened to him." "He was trying to protect you," Isaac said softly. "Yes, though I doubt he anticipated Rutherford's duplicity." Eleanor's fingers tightened around her cup. Or that his lessons would lead me to becoming a fugitive. Isaac's expression turned serious. Do you regret it, taking back your bank book, running? Eleanor considered the question, looking around the humble cabin that had become a kind of sanctuary. No, she said finally. I regret the necessity, but not the action. Father worked too hard for his money to let a man like Rutherford steal it. A slow smile spread across Isaac's face, warming his blue eyes. You're a remarkable woman, Eleanor Kent. The way he said her name sent a pleasant shiver through her, one that she was finding increasingly difficult to ignore. Over the past days, Eleanor had become acutely aware of Isaac as more than just her protector and ally. She noticed the way sunlight caught the varying shades of brown in his hair, how his hands, strong and calloused from years of ranch work, could be surprisingly gentle when tending a fire or binding a cut on her finger when she sliced it preparing vegetables. Most of all, she noticed the growing tenderness in his gaze when he looked at her, a tenderness that both thrilled and terrified her. They were alone here, far from the judgmental eyes of society, but that very isolation created its own danger. Eleanor had been raised to guard her reputation carefully, to maintain proper distance from men who weren't family. Yet here she was, living in intimate proximity with a man who was becoming increasingly important to her. One afternoon, about 10 days into their exile, Eleanor was washing clothes in a nearby stream while Isaac checked snares he had set the previous day. The day was warm, the mountain air sweet with the scent of pine and wildflowers. As she worked, Eleanor found herself singing softly an old lullaby her mother had taught her, one she hadn't thought of in years. She was so absorbed in her task that she didn't hear Isaac approach until he spoke. That's beautiful. Eleanor started, nearly dropping the shirt she was wringing out. I didn't realize you were there. I didn't want to interrupt, Isaac said, setting down a pair of rabbits he had collected from the snares. I haven't heard you sing before. It's just an old song my mother used to sing, Eleanor replied, feeling strangely self-conscious. I don't even know why I remembered it just now. Isaac crouched beside her at the stream's edge, rolling up his sleeves to wash his hands. Perhaps because you're happy, the observation caught Eleanor by surprise. Was she happy? Here, a fugitive in the wilderness with an uncertain future ahead. Yet as she considered Isaac's words, she realized there was truth to them. Despite their circumstances, there had been moments of genuine joy in these past days, laughter over shared stories, the satisfaction of mastering new skills, the simple pleasure of conversation with someone who respected her mind. Perhaps I am, she admitted, meeting his gaze. Is that strange? Not strange, Isaac replied, his voice softening. Remarkable. He was close enough that Eleanor could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the slight stubble on his jaw that he hadn't yet shaved that morning. Without thinking, she reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw as if to confirm he was real. Isaac went very still under her touch, his breath catching audibly. For a long moment, they remained frozen in that tableau, Eleanor's hand against his cheek, his eyes locked on hers. Then, with exquisite slowness, Isaac leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Eleanor found herself responding instinctively, her hand sliding to the nape of his neck as the kiss deepened. It was nothing like the chaste pecks she had received from potential suitors at Leadville's socials. This was a revelation warm and sweet, and somehow both tender and urgent at once. When they finally broke apart, Eleanor was breathless, her heart racing beneath her ribs. Isaac looked equally affected, his blue eyes darkened with emotion. I've wanted to do that since the day you stood up to Rutherford in the bank, he confessed, his voice husky. You were so brave, so righteous in your anger, I'd never seen anything like it. Eleanor laughed softly, surprised by his admission. I thought I was just being reckless. No, Isaac said seriously. You were standing up for what was right, consequences be damned. That's not recklessness, it's courage. His words warmed her more than the kiss had, touching something deep within her soul. In that moment, Eleanor realized that what she felt for Isaac went beyond gratitude or physical attraction. During their time together, she had come to admire his integrity, his intelligence, his quiet strength, and somewhere along the way, that admiration had blossomed into something deeper, something that both exhilarated and terrified her. "Isaac," she began, not entirely sure what she wanted to say, only knowing that something needed to be acknowledged between them. But whatever words might have followed were interrupted by the distant sound of hoofbeats, multiple horses approaching from the direction of the trail. Isaac was instantly alert, rising to his feet and pulling Eleanor up beside him. "Get back to the cabin," he said urgently, reaching for the rifle he always carried. "Quickly." Eleanor gathered the wet laundry, her heart pounding with renewed fear. They had been so careful, keeping fires small, staying away from open areas where they might be spotted. Who could have found them? As they hurried back toward the cabin, the sound of horses grew louder. Isaac positioned himself between Eleanor and the approaching riders, his rifle ready as 5 mounted men emerged from the trees into the small clearing around the cabin. Relief flooded through Eleanor when she recognized Thomas Whitehorse at the head of the group. Beside him rode an older man with a distinguished bearing and a neatly trimmed white beard. The other 3 men wore the badges of U.S. Marshals. "It's all right," Thomas called out, raising a hand in greeting. "We come with good news." Isaac lowered his rifle slightly, though he remained wary. "You're back early." Thomas dismounted, followed by the older man who approached with a formal bearing. "Miss Kent, Mr. Calloway," he said, extending his hand to Isaac. "I'm Judge William Matthews of the federal court in Denver. Mr. Whitehorse has shared your story with me, and I've reviewed the evidence in your father's bank book, Miss Kent." Eleanor stepped forward, hardly daring to hope, and the judge's stern expression softened. "It was exactly as you claimed. Furthermore, when I presented this evidence to the governor, he authorized an investigation into Horace Rutherford's banking practices. The marshals here executed a search warrant on the Leadville bank 2 days ago." One of the marshals stepped forward, a burly man with a weathered face. "We found ledgers with altered entries, Miss Kent, dozens of them, including records pertaining to Mr. Calloway's brother. Rutherford is in custody awaiting trial, and the charges against me," Eleanor asked, scarcely able to believe what she was hearing. "Dismissed," the judge said firmly. "Sheriff Dawson has been informed that you were acting lawfully in reclaiming your own property. You're free to return to Leadville whenever you wish." The realization that their ordeal was over, that justice would be served, was overwhelming. Eleanor felt tears of relief spring to her eyes as Isaac's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her. "Thank you," Isaac said to the judge, his voice thick with emotion, "for believing us, for acting so quickly." Judge Matthews nodded solemnly. "It's my duty to uphold the law, Mr. Calloway. And what Rutherford was doing was a perversion of justice that couldn't be allowed to continue." He turned to Eleanor. "Your father's funds will be released to you, Miss Kent, and Mr. Calloway, there will be a full accounting of your brother's investments as well." As the men discussed the details of Rutherford's arrest and the evidence against him, Eleanor found herself overcome with conflicting emotions. Relief at being vindicated and no longer a fugitive ward with an unexpected sense of loss. Their time in the cabin, the intimacy they had shared, the connection they had formed was coming to an end. What would happen when they returned to civilization? Would Isaac stay in Leadville now that his quest for justice was complete? Would he return to Texas? And where did that leave whatever was growing between them? The questions swirled in her mind as preparations were made for their return journey. The judge and marshals would continue on to Denver, while Thomas had offered to accompany Eleanor and Isaac back to Leadville. By morning, they would be leaving the sanctuary that had sheltered them these past 2 weeks. That evening, after their visitors had made camp nearby, Eleanor and Isaac found themselves alone in the cabin for the last time. The atmosphere between them was charged with unspoken thoughts and the memory of their interrupted moment by the stream. "It doesn't seem real," Eleanor said as she folded the few belongings she had acquired during their stay, going back to town to normal life. Isaac watched her from his place by the fire. Are you glad? She paused, considering the question. Yes and no. I'm relieved that the truth is out, that justice will be done, but, Isaac prompted when she fell silent. Eleanor turned to face him fully. But I can't help feeling that nothing will be the same, that I won't be the same. Understanding dawned in Isaac's eyes. He crossed the small space between them, taking her hands in his. You're not the same, Eleanor, neither am I. These past weeks have changed us both. What happens now? She asked, voicing the question that had been haunting her all day. When we go back to Leadville, will you stay, or will you return to Texas? Isaac's thumbs traced gentle circles on the backs of her hands. That depends, he said softly. On what? His blue eyes held hers, open and vulnerable in a way she hadn't seen before. On whether I have a reason to stay. The implication of his words hung in the air between them, both a question and an invitation. Eleanor felt her heart swell with emotion, hope, fear, and something deeper that she was finally ready to acknowledge. Isaac, she began carefully, when you came to my rescue that day in town, I thought you were just being chivalrous, a good man helping someone in need. But it's become something more than that, hasn't it? At least it has for me. The hope that kindled in his eyes gave her courage to continue. These weeks together talking, laughing, learning about each other, they've shown me what kind of man you truly are. Honorable, intelligent, kind. The kind of man I could. She hesitated, the word catching in her throat. Love. Isaac finished for her, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the emotion tightening her chest. In response, Isaac released her hands only to frame her face gently between his palms. I have loved you since you defied convention and the law to stand up for what was right, he confessed, his gaze unwavering. I love your courage, your intelligence, your compassion. And if you'll have me, Eleanor Kent, I would very much like to stay in Leadville or go wherever you wish to go as long as we're together. Tears of joy spilled down Eleanor's cheeks as she covered his hands with her own. I love you too, Isaac Calloway, and yes, I would like that very much. This time when he kissed her, there was no hesitation, no questioning, only the certainty of two people who had found in each other something worth fighting for, something worth building a future upon. The return to Leadville the next day was both triumphant and surreal. Word of Rutherford's arrest and the dismissal of charges against Eleanor had spread through town like wildfire. As they rode down Harrison Avenue, people stopped to stare and whisper, some supportive, others clearly dismayed by the fall of one of the town's most powerful men. Eleanor held her head high, Isaac riding beside her as Thomas followed a few paces behind. They made a striking trio, the copper-haired woman who had defied a banking baron, the tall Texan who had risked everything to help her, and the half-Ute guide who moved between worlds with quiet dignity. At the sheriff's office, they found a chastened Sheriff Dawson waiting to offer a formal apology to Eleanor. Miss Kent, I acted hastily based on Mr. Rutherford's accusations. I hope you can forgive the misunderstanding. It wasn't a misunderstanding, Sheriff, Eleanor replied evenly. It was an injustice, one that has now been corrected thanks to Judge Matthews and these gentlemen, she gestured to Isaac and Thomas. But I accept your apology, provided you extend it to them as well. The sheriff looked uncomfortable but nodded. Of course. Mr. Calloway, Mr. Whitehorse, the county appreciates your assistance in exposing Mr. Rutherford's crimes. It wasn't much as apologies went, but it was public acknowledgement of their vindication, which was all Eleanor had really wanted. From the sheriff's office, they proceeded to the bank, now under the temporary management of the assistant manager while awaiting a permanent replacement for Rutherford. Here, too, apologies were offered, and Eleanor's access to her father's accounts was immediately restored. The assistant manager, a nervous young man named Peterson, explained that investigators had discovered at least 37 accounts that Rutherford had tampered with following the deaths of account holders. Your father's was one of the largest, Miss Kent, Peterson explained, pushing papers across the desk for her signature. But there were many smaller accounts as well, minors who left families with little means to challenge a powerful man like Mr. Rutherford. And Michael Calloway's investment? Isaac asked, his voice tight with emotion. Peterson nodded, pulling another file from his desk. Yes, sir. That was one of the first accounts the investigators identified. Your brother's claim was indeed registered properly, and the proceeds have been held in trust. With interest, it comes to just over $4,000. Eleanor watched as Isaac absorbed this news, the confirmation that his brother had been cheated, but also the vindication of his quest for justice. $4,000 was a substantial sum, enough to purchase a decent property or start a new business. It represented both closure for the past and opportunity for the future. As they left the bank, Eleanor felt a weight lift from her shoulders that she had been carrying since her father's death. She had upheld his legacy, protected what he had worked so hard to build for her future. Now that future stretched before her, filled with possibilities she hadn't dared imagine just weeks ago. Thomas took his leave of them at the hotel, declining their invitation to stay for dinner. "I've had enough of town for one day," he said with a small smile, "but I'll be around if you need me." The mountains aren't going anywhere. After he departed, Eleanor and Isaac found themselves standing somewhat awkwardly in the hotel lobby, suddenly aware of the return of social conventions and expectations. "I should find lodging," Isaac said, glancing around the busy hotel. "Perhaps check if my old room at the boarding house is available." Eleanor hesitated, then made a decision. "Have dinner with me first," she said. "I owe you that much at least." "You don't owe me anything, Eleanor," Isaac protested. She smiled, touching his arm lightly. "Then let me rephrase. I would very much like to have dinner with the man I love before we face the curiosity and gossip of the entire town." The word love, spoken so openly between them, even in the hushed tones of a hotel lobby, sent a visible thrill through Isaac. "When you put it that way," he said, offering his arm, "how could I possibly refuse?" Over dinner in the hotel's dining room, they discussed practical matters, where Eleanor would live now that she had access to her funds again, what Isaac might do with his brother's recovered investment, how they might move forward with the understanding that had developed between them during their time in the wilderness. "I own my father's house outright," Eleanor explained as they lingered over coffee. "It's a comfortable place on Pine Street, too large for just me, but—" She paused, gathering her courage, "but perhaps not too large for a family someday." Isaac's eyes softened at her words. "Are you proposing, Miss Kent?" he teased gently. "Merely thinking aloud, Mr. Calloway," she replied, a blush coloring her cheeks. "Although I will say that 2 weeks in a one-room cabin has rather accelerated my understanding of what I want for my future." "And what is that?" Isaac asked, his tone serious now despite the smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "A partner. Someone who respects my mind and my independence. Someone who stands for justice even when it's difficult. Someone who sees me as I truly am, not as society expects me to be." She took a breath. "I want you, Isaac, however improper that may sound." Isaac reached across the table to take her hand, his thumb caressing her palm in a gesture that had become familiar during their time together. "There's nothing improper about a woman knowing her own heart," he said. "And if you're sure that's what you want, Eleanor, I would be honored to build a life with you here in Leadville or elsewhere." "Here," Eleanor said decisively, "at least for now. I want to see Rutherford face justice for what he did to my father and your brother and all the others, and afterward, well, we can decide together." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Eleanor reopened her father's house, hiring a housekeeper to help restore it to its former condition after 2 months of minimal care. Isaac secured rooms at a respectable boarding house while he explored possibilities for investing his brother's recovered funds. Together, they helped the marshals and Judge Matthews prepare for Rutherford's trial, providing statements and evidence that would ensure the banker faced the full consequences of his actions. Throughout this time, they maintained propriety in public dining together frequently, attending church, taking walks along Leadville's busy streets while privately their relationship deepened. Isaac's visits to Eleanor's home were carefully timed to avoid gossip, with the housekeeper always present as a chaperone. Yet even within these constraints, They found moments to share a touch of hands as they sat in the parlor, a brief kiss in the garden when the housekeeper was occupied elsewhere, long conversations about their hopes and dreams for the future. By the time Rutherford's trial began in early December, the story of the banker's crimes and Eleanor and Isaac's role in exposing them had become something of a local legend. Newspapers as far away as Denver covered the proceedings, painting Eleanor as a courageous heiress who had risked everything to seek justice, and Isaac as the honorable cowboy who had stood by her side against overwhelming odds. "They've romanticized it considerably," Eleanor remarked one evening as they sat by the fire in her parlor, reading the latest account in the Rocky Mountain News. The dashing Texan rancher and the copper-haired heiress outfoxed the corrupt banker in a wilderness hideaway. "It sounds like a dime novel," Isaac chuckled, setting aside his coffee cup. "Would you prefer they knew the less glamorous truth, the leaky roof of that trapper's cabin, the days when all we had to eat was stringy rabbit and wild onions?" Eleanor smiled, remembering those simple meals shared across a rough-hewn table. "Those were some of my favorite moments," she admitted. "Just the two of us, talking about everything and nothing, no pretense, no social niceties, just us." "It won't always be like that, you know," Isaac said, his expression turning serious. "If we marry when we marry, there will be expectations. Society has rules, especially for a woman of your standing." "I'm aware," Eleanor replied, equally serious. "But I think we've proven we can face challenges together, don't you? Besides, Leadville isn't exactly Boston or New York. Frontier society has always been more adaptable." Isaac nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. "Speaking of marriage," he began, suddenly seeming nervous. "I had planned to wait until after the trial, but—" He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I find I can't wait any longer." Eleanor's breath caught as he moved to kneel before her chair. "Isaac." "Eleanor Kent," he said, opening the box to reveal a delicate gold ring set with a modest diamond flanked by two small sapphires. "These past months have shown me what true courage and integrity look like. You've made me a better man by loving me, and I want nothing more than to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that love." He took a steadying breath. "Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Eleanor's vision as she looked from the beautiful ring to the man offering it. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Isaac Calloway, I will marry you." With hands that trembled slightly, Isaac slipped the ring onto her finger before rising to pull her into his arms. Their kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. "The sapphires reminded me of your eyes that first day," Eleanor said softly when they finally broke apart. "When you found me behind that water trough and said, 'Follow me if you want to get out of this.'" Isaac smiled, touching her cheek gently. "Best decision I ever made, stepping into that fight. Even though the law could have arrested you too," Eleanor teased, quoting his words from that fateful day. "Especially then," Isaac replied with complete sincerity. "Some things are worth the risk." Rutherford's trial concluded 3 days before Christmas with a guilty verdict on all counts. The former banker was sentenced to 15 years in the territorial prison, and full restitution was ordered for all the affected accounts. It was, Judge Matthews declared, a victory for justice and a warning to others who might abuse positions of trust. For Eleanor and Isaac, it represented closure, the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. With the trial behind them and their engagement announced in the Leadville Chronicle, they turned their attention to planning their future together. They were married on a bright January morning in 1884, with snow blanketing the mountains around Leadville and sunlight streaming through the stained glass windows of St. George's Episcopal Church. Thomas Whitehorse stood as Isaac's best man, cutting an imposing figure in a formal suit that contrasted with his usual buckskins. Eleanor, radiant in a gown of ivory silk, was attended by Martha Collins, the daughter of her father's former business partner and one of the few friends who had stood by her during the difficult months following her father's death. Judge Matthews performed the ceremony, his official dignity softened by genuine affection for the couple whose courage had brought a powerful criminal to justice. As Eleanor and Isaac exchanged vows, the church filled with townspeople who had come to witness the union that had already become part of local lore, the thief, who wasn't a thief, and the cowboy who had risked everything for justice and love. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge declared, and as Isaac leaned in to kiss his bride, a cheer went up from the assembled guests that nearly rattled the church's rafters. The reception that followed at Eleanor's home, now their home, was a blend of frontier practicality and elegant celebration. Champagne flowed alongside whiskey, delicate pastries from the French bakery shared platters with hearty venison stew, and music from a string quartet eventually gave way to livelier fiddle tunes that had even the most dignified guests tapping their feet. As the celebration continued around them, Eleanor and Isaac slipped away to the quiet of her father's study, a room that now held Isaac's books alongside the leather-bound volumes that had belonged to Jonathan Kent. "Happy, Mrs. Calloway?" Isaac asked, drawing her into his arms. The name, her new name, sent a thrill through Eleanor. "Happier than I ever thought possible," she replied, leaning into his embrace. "And you, Mr. Calloway, any regrets about tying your future to a woman once accused of theft?" Isaac laughed, the sound warm and rich in the quiet room. "Only that I didn't do it sooner." He grew serious, tucking a strand of copper hair behind her ear. "I've been thinking about what comes next for us." "And what have you decided?" Eleanor asked, curious about the thoughtful expression on his face. "I've been talking with Thomas and some of the other miners who were cheated by Rutherford," Isaac explained. "Many of them don't have the means to develop their claims properly, even with their money returned. I thought perhaps we could form a cooperative, a company that would provide fair financing for small claim holders, help them work their mines without falling prey to men like Rutherford." Eleanor's eyes widened with interest. "Using Michael's recovered investment as capital?" Isaac nodded. "And some of your father's funds, if you're willing. I want to build something lasting, Eleanor, something that honors both our brothers and your father, something that makes Leadville a fairer place." "A mining and investment cooperative," Eleanor mused, her quick mind already considering the possibilities. "With fair terms, transparent accounting." She smiled up at him. "You'll need someone with a head for figures and contracts." "I was hoping you might volunteer," Isaac said, returning her smile. "I can handle the practical mining aspects, but the financial side requires someone with your expertise." The idea was unconventional. A woman as an equal partner in such a venture would raise eyebrows even in a frontier town like Leadville. But then, everything about their relationship had defied convention from the start. "Partners in every sense," Eleanor said, raising her face for a kiss that sealed their new venture as surely as their wedding vows had sealed their lives. Over the years that followed, the Calloway Mining Cooperative grew into one of the most respected businesses in Colorado's mining districts. Under Isaac and Eleanor's joint leadership, it provided fair financing and technical assistance to dozens of small claim holders, many of whom might otherwise have lost their stakes to larger companies or unscrupulous bankers. Their personal life flourished alongside their business success. In the spring of 1885, their first child was born, a son they named Michael Jonathan Calloway, in honor of both Isaac's brother and Eleanor's father. 2 years later, a daughter joined the family, Rose Elizabeth, with her mother's copper hair and her father's blue eyes. A third child, Thomas James, completed their family in 1890, named for the friend who had remained an important part of their lives through the years. Leadville changed too, as the silver boom eventually waned and the town's character evolved. Through it all, the Calloway home on Pine Street remained a center of community life, a place where miners and merchants, lawyers and laborers could find fair dealing and friendly counsel. On crisp autumn evenings, when the aspen leaves turned gold against the darkening pines, Eleanor and Isaac often sat together on their porch, watching their children play in the yard as the sun set behind the mountains. In those quiet moments, they sometimes reminisced about their extraordinary beginning, the desperate flight from town, the weeks in hiding that had forged their bond, the fight for justice that had united them in purpose, before love united their hearts. Do you ever wonder how different our lives might have been if I hadn't been at the bank that day? Isaac asked on one such evening, his arm around Eleanor's shoulders as they watched 10-year-old Michael teaching his younger siblings how to throw a lasso. Eleanor considered the question, her hand finding Isaac's as naturally as breathing. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," she said with quiet certainty. "Some things are simply meant to be." Isaac smiled, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Like a thief who wasn't a thief and a cowboy fool enough to say then the law can arrest me too." "Exactly like that," Eleanor replied, turning her face to meet his kiss properly. "Exactly like us." As twilight deepened into dusk and the first stars appeared above the mountains, the Calloways gathered their children and moved inside, closing the door on the cooling evening air. Light spilled from their windows across the garden, a beacon of the home they had built together, a home founded on courage, justice, and a love that had begun in the most unlikely of circumstances. In the years to come, their story would be told and retold throughout the mining camps and settlements of the West, sometimes embellished, often romanticized, but always preserving the essential truth. That in the autumn of 1883, a woman unjustly accused had found both justice and love in the arms of a cowboy willing to stand beside her against the world. Their legacy lived on not just in their children or the business they built, but in the example they set of integrity in a time of greed, of partnership in a time of inequality, and of love that found its strongest expression in the pursuit of justice. And whenever anyone in Leadville recounted the tale, they always began with the same words. They called her a thief, but the cowboy said, "Then the law can arrest me too."